No, this is impossible. How could they keep this from me?
10 years of marriage. 10 years of building something with him. Brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. Until it looked like the kind of life people admire from a distance. Renee Ashford believed she knew every version of her husband Derek. The tired version after a 16-hour job site. The proud version watching their son score his first touchdown. The gentle version who used to write her letters before he could afford flowers. She thought 10 years had shown her all of him. She was wrong. On the balcony of a resort in Turks and Caicos, wrapped in the ocean breeze they had saved 2 years to afford, Renee's entire world folded into the light of a single phone screen. A message meant for someone else. A message that was never supposed to reach her eyes. And in that instant, everything she believed about her marriage quietly died. She did not scream. She did not cry out. She simply stood there, barefoot on cool tile, the Caribbean waves rolling in behind her, like they had rolled in every night that week, indifferent to the fact that her life had just been rewritten. Derek was still inside, laughing at something on television, unaware that his wife now held proof of a betrayal years in the making. Renee would later say, the hardest part was not the message itself, it was the calm on his face when she confronted him. Not shock, not panic, just the tired irritation of a man caught, rather than a man ashamed. That single moment, on their 10th anniversary, became the moment Renee decided she would tear it all down. Before we go further into how far this betrayal really went, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and if you have not already, take a second to subscribe so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. What Renee did not know that night was how long this had truly been going on. She did not know that the woman on the other end of that message was not a stranger, but someone who sat across from Derek in board meetings. Someone who had shaken Renee's hand at company dinners and smiled at her children. She did not know that money she believed was building their future had quietly been rerouted into accounts she had never seen. She did not know that the anniversary trip Derek insisted on planning himself was never truly about her at all. Renee only knew one thing as she stood on that balcony. The man she trusted with everything had been living beside her for years while hiding a piece of himself she never got to see. By the time she boarded the flight home, Renee had already begun asking herself questions she never imagined she would need to answer. How long had this affair really lasted? Was the business they built together still hers, or had it quietly become something else while she wasn't looking? And the question that would follow her through every sleepless night that came after. Was leaving enough, or would walking away cost her more than she was prepared to lose? What Renee did not yet understand was that the balcony was only the beginning of a fight that would test everything she believed about loyalty, ownership, and what it means to walk away from a life someone else built around her. To understand how far Renee had fallen that night, you have to understand how high she and Derek once stood. They met in their early 20s, in a small Georgia town where everybody knew everybody's business. At a community fundraiser neither of them wanted to attend. Derek was working construction jobs on the weekends, saving toward a dream he barely spoke about out loud. Renee was finishing a business degree, sharp, disciplined, the kind of woman who kept receipts and read contracts twice. They fell into each other, the way people do when both of them are hungry for something more than what they were handed. Within 2 years, they were married in her grandmother's backyard, folding chairs and all, promising each other a future neither of them could fully picture yet, but both of them were determined to build. What made their story different from so many others was that Renee did not simply support Derek's dream from the sidelines. She became the backbone of it. While Derek swung hammers and won contracts through sheer charm and grit, Renee taught herself bookkeeping late at night, learned payroll software from online tutorials, and turned Derek's one-man operation into a registered company within 3 years. Friends used to joke that Derek built the houses, but Renee built the business. She never minded the joke because it was true, and because she believed every dollar she helped generate was theirs, not his, theirs. That belief would matter more than she ever imagined years later, when everything came apart. By their 5th year of marriage, Ashford Construction had grown from a 2-man crew into a company with 12 employees and a real office downtown. They bought a home in a neighborhood Renee's mother used to clean houses in as a young woman, a detail Renee never let herself forget. They had two children, Malik and Jada, and every Sunday the family piled into a minivan for church, then dinner at Renee's mother's table. From the outside, the Ashfords looked like proof that hard work and loyalty still meant something. Neighbors admired them. Derek's own brothers looked up to him. Nobody, least of all Renee, could have predicted that the very success she helped build would become the thing she would later have to fight to keep. It was around year 7 that something in Derek began to shift, subtly, in ways Renee noticed but talked herself out of questioning. He started taking calls outside, phone pressed tightly to his ear, voice dropping the moment she walked into a room. He brought on a new business partner named Brianna Cole, a sharp, ambitious young woman who handled client relationships and quickly became, in Derek's words, indispensable to the company's growth. Renee met her exactly twice before the trip. Once at a company dinner where Brianna complimented Renee's dress a little too warmly. Once at a holiday party where Brianna held Jada's hand for a photograph like she had known her for years. Renee smiled through both moments, never once suspecting what those smiles were quietly covering. Around this same time, Renee's own mother began noticing changes in her daughter that had nothing to do with Derek directly. Renee had started working longer hours herself, partly to keep up with the company's growth, and partly, she would later admit, to avoid confronting a distance that had quietly settled between her and Derek. Date nights became rare. Conversations at dinner shrank down to logistics about the kids and the business, rarely touching anything deeper. Renee told herself this was simply what marriage looked like after a decade and 2 children, a natural settling into routine rather than a warning sign. Many of the friends she confided in later admitted they had assumed the same thing about their own marriages, which is exactly why none of them thought to ask Renee if she was truly happy. Looking back, Renee would later admit there were signs she chose not to see. The canceled anniversary trip the year before, blamed on a client emergency that never quite added up. The new cologne Derek started wearing that she didn't recognize. The way he angled his phone away from her at dinner, a habit so small she almost never noticed it. Friends tell you hindsight makes fools of all of us, and Renee would agree. She had built her entire adult life around trusting this man completely. And trust, once given that deeply, does not go looking for reasons to break itself. It waits patiently to be broken, and Derek, without her knowing it, had already begun that process years before she ever stepped onto that balcony. Then came this year's anniversary trip, planned entirely by Derek himself. Down to the resort, the flights, even a surprise dinner reservation on the beach. Renee remembers feeling almost suspicious of how perfect it all was, joking to her sister that Derek had never planned anything this thoughtful in his life. Her sister laughed and told her to enjoy it, to stop overthinking a good thing. Renee tried. She truly tried to simply enjoy 10 years of marriage in paradise, unaware that the very effort Derek poured into making the trip appear flawless was the same effort he used to hide the fractures underneath. Paradise, as Renee would soon learn, is often the most convincing disguise for the truth someone is desperate to bury. The trip started exactly as Derek had promised. Private dinners on the sand, morning walks along the shoreline, a couple's massage Renee had mentioned wanting nearly a year earlier. For the first 2 days, Renee genuinely believed this was the reconnection they needed after a stressful year of expansion at the company. She allowed herself to relax for the first time in months, taking photos of the two of them by the water, sending them proudly to her mother and sister with captions about renewed love and second honeymoons. Those same photographs would later feel almost cruel to look back on, evidence of just how convincingly Derek had managed to perform a role he no longer truly believed in. By the 3rd night, small cracks began appearing beneath the surface of the vacation. Derek's phone buzzed constantly during dinner, a habit he excused as urgent business matters he couldn't ignore, even on their anniversary. He stepped away from their table twice to take calls outside, returning each time a little more distracted, a little more distant, though Renee still refused to let her mind wander anywhere dangerous. She noticed the resort staff exchanging quick glances during one of his longer absences, though she would not understand the meaning behind those glances until much later, when she learned that Derek had been overheard on the phone using a name that was not hers. It was on their 4th night, while Derek showered before dinner, that Renee reached for his phone simply to take a photo of the sunset for her mother. who loved seeing every detail of their trips. A message notification lit up the screen before she could open the camera. She did not go looking for it. It found her. The name attached to the message was Brianna's, and the words on that screen were not the words of a business partner. They were intimate, familiar, affectionate, in a way that instantly told Renee everything she needed to know, long before she allowed herself to fully process it. Her hands went cold, her chest tightened, and for a long moment, Renee simply stared at the screen, waiting for her mind to convince her she had misread it. She had not misread it. When Derek stepped out of the bathroom, Renee held up the phone without a single word, watching his face carefully. What she saw next would stay with her far longer than the message itself. Derek did not panic. He did not immediately deny it. He simply sighed, the way a man sighs when he is more frustrated at being caught than sorry for what he has done. That reaction told Renee this was not a slip, not a single mistake made in a weak moment. This was something familiar to him, something he had done before, and likely something he had grown comfortable hiding. In that instant, 10 years of trust collapsed into a silence so heavy that even the sound of the waves outside seemed to fade away. The confrontation that followed spilled out onto the beach outside their villa.
We cannot keep living like this, Derek!
You are pulling away from everything we built!
Derek admitted, reluctantly, that his relationship with Brianna had crossed a line months earlier, though he insisted it wasn't what it looked like, a phrase Renee would come to despise. She asked him plainly how long it had been going on. He hesitated before answering, and that hesitation alone told her the truth mattered less to him than managing her reaction. When he finally admitted it had been going on for over a year, Renee felt something inside her shift permanently. Not sadness first, but clarity. A cold, steady clarity that told her nothing about their marriage was what she believed it to be. Renee asked one more question that night, one Derek clearly did not expect. She asked him whether Brianna's role in the company had anything to do with what was happening between them. Derek's hesitation this time lasted even longer than before, and when he finally answered, his response felt rehearsed rather than honest. He insisted the business and the affair were entirely separate, that Brianna's ownership stake had been earned through her work alone. Renee did not believe him, though she had no proof yet to challenge his version of events. She simply filed the question away, quietly promising herself that she would find the answer on her own terms, once she was no longer standing on a beach in the dark, blindsided and unprepared. That night, Renee packed a bag with shaking hands, fully intending to leave the resort and fly home alone. But Derek, panicked at the thought of the trip ending in public embarrassment, begged her to stay until morning, promising to explain everything calmly once they were both less emotional. Renee agreed, only because exhaustion had replaced her anger by that point, and because some small part of her still wanted an explanation that made sense of the man she thought she knew. She lay awake the entire night beside a husband who felt like a stranger, staring at the ceiling, replaying years of memories she now had to question. It was, she would later say, the longest night of her entire life. Renee flew home the next morning in silence, Derek beside her offering explanations she barely absorbed. The moment she walked through their front door, she understood that returning to normal life was no longer possible. She hugged her children tightly, holding back tears until they were out of sight, then sat alone in her car in the driveway for nearly an hour, unable to bring herself to walk back inside. Word of the confrontation had already begun spreading quietly through mutual friends, the way these things always do. And by the end of that first week home, Renee found herself fielding careful phone calls from people who clearly knew more than they were letting on. Betrayal, she realized, rarely stays contained to just two people. Her best friend, Michelle Turner, became the first person Renee told the full truth to, sitting across from her at Renee's kitchen table late one night after the kids had gone to bed. Michelle listened without interrupting, then asked the question Renee hadn't allowed herself to consider yet. Not simply whether she would leave Derek, but what leaving would actually cost her, given how deeply intertwined her life and identity had become with the business they built together. That single question shifted something in Renee. This was no longer only a story about a broken marriage. It was about ownership, about years of unpaid labor poured into a company that legally may not have protected her the way she assumed it did. Renee's mother, a woman who had survived her own share of heartbreak decades earlier, offered advice that surprised her. Rather than pushing Renee toward forgiveness or toward anger, she simply told her daughter to find out the truth before making any decision at all. "Don't let your heart decide something your eyes haven't confirmed yet," she said, a piece of guidance that sent Renee down a path she hadn't expected to take. Renee's father, quieter than her mother by nature, only added one thing during that conversation. He reminded her that she had built skills of her own, long before Derek ever put a ring on her finger, and that those skills belonged to her alone, regardless of what happened to the marriage. Over the following weeks, Renee quietly began gathering financial documents, bank statements, and business records, driven less by revenge and more by a growing need to understand exactly what her marriage and her decade of work actually amounted to on paper. She spent late nights after the children were asleep, combing through years of statements, cross-referencing dates, circling transactions that made no sense to her. It became almost obsessive, this need to understand the architecture of a life she had helped construct, without ever fully seeing its blueprints. Each new document she uncovered chipped away a little more at the version of her marriage she had believed in for a decade. What Renee uncovered during those weeks unsettled her far more than the affair itself. Buried within business accounts she rarely had access to, she found transfers of company funds into an account under Brianna's name, transfers labeled loosely as consulting fees, despite Brianna's role as a full business partner. She found a secondary bank account Derek had opened without her knowledge, one that had quietly received deposits for nearly 2 years. The affair, painful as it was, now looked like only one piece of a larger pattern Derek had built around it. Renee began to understand that she was not simply dealing with infidelity. She was dealing with a husband who may have been rewriting the financial truth of their marriage long before she ever suspected anything on that balcony. As Renee dug deeper, conflicting voices surrounded her. Some friends urged her to fight for the marriage, reminding her of the children, the years invested, the community they had built together. Others, including Michelle, urged her to protect herself first and worry about reconciliation later, if at all. Even Derek's own mother, in an uncomfortable phone call, hinted that Derek had always struggled with temptation, a comment that revealed this may not have been his first betrayal, simply the first one Renee had discovered. Renee sat with that comment for days, wondering how many other people in Derek's life had quietly known pieces of a truth she was only now beginning to uncover for herself. Each new piece of information complicated Renee's decision further, pulling her in directions that left her exhausted by the end of most days, caught between the life she had built and the truth slowly dismantling it. There were nights she found herself standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m, staring at nothing in particular, wondering if she had the strength to start over completely at this stage of her life. And there were other nights where anger carried her forward instead, reminding her that whatever came next, she refused to let Derek's choices define the rest of her story. The turning point came when Renee discovered that Brianna's ownership stake in the company had been financed using a loan co-signed under Renee's name, something Renee had signed years earlier during what she believed was a routine business expansion. She had trusted Derek's explanation at the time without question, the same way she had trusted him for a decade. Now, staring at her own signature beside a decision that had unknowingly funded her husband's affair, Renee felt something harden inside her. This was no longer only about heartbreak. This was about a woman who had unknowingly signed away pieces of her own security, and she intended to find out exactly how much of it she still had a legal right to reclaim. Renee scheduled a meeting with a business attorney named Mr. Patterson, a calm, methodical man who had handled small business disputes for over 20 years. She brought him every document she had gathered, laying them across his desk, like pieces of a puzzle she was finally ready to see completed. Patterson reviewed the paperwork carefully before delivering the piece of information that would change everything. Because Renee's name remained on the original business formation documents, and because she had contributed both labor and capital since the company's founding, she legally held a far larger ownership stake than Derek had ever led her to believe. Brianna's added ownership, in fact, may not have been properly authorized at all. Patterson explained further that under the laws governing their state, any major transfer of ownership within a marital business typically required consent from both spouses, particularly when marital funds were involved in financing that transfer. Since Renee had never knowingly consented to Brianna receiving an ownership stake, the entire arrangement stood on shaky legal ground. Patterson recommended bringing in a forensic accountant to trace every dollar that had moved between the company, the secondary account Derek had opened, and Brianna's personal finances. Renee agreed immediately, understanding that the more documentation she gathered now, the stronger her position would become in whatever negotiation or legal battle followed. This revelation reframed everything for Renee. She was not a woman with no power in this situation, forced to simply accept whatever Derek decided to offer her in a separation. She was, according to the law, and according to a decade of unpaid work, an equal architect of everything Ashford Construction had become. Patterson explained that if the improper transfers to Brianna could be proven, Renee would not only be entitled to her fair share of the company, she may be entitled to significantly more, given how much marital and business funds had been diverted without her consent. For the first time since that night on the balcony, Renee felt something other than grief. She felt the quiet return of control. The forensic accountant, a sharp woman named Miss Whitfield, spent nearly a month combing through years of financial records before presenting her findings to Renee and Patterson together. The pattern she uncovered was more extensive than even Renee had feared. Small amounts, diverted consistently over nearly 2 years, dressed up as legitimate business expenses, vendor payments, and consulting fees that traced back not to actual consulting work, but directly to Brianna's personal accounts and, in several instances, to travel and gifts that had nothing to do with the business at all. Renee sat through the presentation with her hands folded tightly in her lap, absorbing every number as though each one were a small, separate betrayal stacked on top of the first. When Renee confronted Derek with this information, his demeanor shifted entirely. Gone was the calm irritation from the balcony. In its place was quiet panic, the realization that Renee was no longer simply a wounded wife he could manage with soft apologies. She was a woman who understood exactly what she was owed, and exactly how to claim it. Derek attempted to negotiate privately, offering to buy out Brianna's stake quietly and keep the business intact, framing it as a way to protect their children's future. Renee listened calmly before making her position clear. She was no longer interested in protecting a life built partly on funds funneled toward the woman who had helped dismantle her marriage. The following weeks brought a series of difficult meetings between lawyers, forensic accountants, and, at one particularly tense sit-down, Brianna herself, who claimed she had no idea the loan Renee co-signed had been used to fund her ownership stake. Brianna insisted throughout the meeting that Derek had presented the arrangement to her as fully authorized and that she believed her role in the company was entirely legitimate. Whether or not that was true became almost irrelevant to Renee by that point. She was no longer fighting simply to prove betrayal. She was fighting to reclaim what a decade of her own effort had rightfully earned her. Word slowly spread through their small business community about the unraveling of Ashford Construction, and Renee found herself, for the first time in years, being seen not as Derek's wife, but as the woman who quietly built the backbone of a company, now fighting to survive its own founder's mistakes. During this period, Derek attempted one final approach, showing up unannounced at Renee's mother's house, where Renee and the children had been staying temporarily. He pleaded with her in front of her mother, promising he could fix everything if she simply gave him one more chance, insisting the business, the affair, and the hidden accounts could all be resolved quietly between the two of them, without lawyers or accountants involved. Renee's mother, standing quietly in the doorway, later told Renee that watching Derek plead in that moment confirmed everything she needed to know. He was not afraid of losing his family. He was afraid of losing control over the outcome. Renee asked him to leave, and for the first time since the balcony, she felt certain of the decision she was about to make. After months of negotiations, a settlement was finally reached. Renee walked away with a significant ownership share liquidated into a direct payout, along with full custody arrangements for Malik and Jada, and a formal acknowledgement that the loan used to fund Brianna's stake had, in fact, been improperly authorized. Derek retained a smaller, restructured version of the company, now burdened with debt and a damaged reputation among clients, who had grown fond of Renee over the years. Brianna's business relationship with Derek dissolved entirely within months, unable to survive the financial and legal fallout that followed. What had once looked like a thriving family business had quietly become a cautionary tale within their community. The settlement negotiations themselves stretched across several tense sessions, with Derek's lawyer initially attempting to minimize Renee's contributions to the company, describing her role as largely administrative rather than foundational. Patterson countered every claim with years of documented evidence, invoices Renee had personally negotiated, contracts she had personally secured, payroll systems she had built entirely on her own. By the final session, even Derek's own lawyer seemed to concede privately that Renee's case was far stronger than Derek had originally led him to believe. Renee later admitted that watching a decade of her quiet, uncredited labor, finally spoken aloud in a room full of lawyers, brought a strange, unexpected sense of vindication she hadn't known she needed. Renee did not disappear quietly into private life after the settlement. Instead, she used both her payout and her decade of hands-on experience to launch her own construction management firm, one built specifically around transparency and fair partnership structures, informed heavily by everything she had lived through. She named the company after her grandmother, the same woman whose backyard had hosted her wedding all those years earlier, a quiet reminder to herself of where her own foundation truly began. Former clients of Ashford Construction, many of whom had worked closely with Renee over the years without realizing how essential she truly was, began reaching out directly, choosing to follow her rather than remain with Derek's restructured company. Within a year, Renee's new firm had secured contracts that rivaled her former marriage's business at its peak, built entirely on her own name this time, rather than someone else's. She hired 2 employees who had left Derek's company shortly after the settlement became public knowledge, both citing a preference to work under leadership they trusted completely. Renee often says that rebuilding a business from nothing, a second time, felt entirely different from the first. The first time, she built quietly, in someone else's shadow. The second time, she built in full view, with her name on the door and her decade of hard-earned experience finally recognized as entirely her own. Malik and Jada, now old enough to understand pieces of what had happened, watched their mother rebuild an entire career in real time, an example Renee hopes will stay with them longer than any painful memory of the divorce itself. She made a point of including them in small parts of the new business, bringing them to job sites on weekends, letting them see firsthand what it looked like for a woman to build something entirely her own. Derek's relationship with the children remained intact, though noticeably more distant than before. A quiet consequence Renee neither encouraged nor discouraged, choosing instead to let her children form their own understanding of their father at their own pace. Reflecting on everything that unfolded, Renee often says the hardest part was never proving the affair. Betrayal, painful as it is, tends to reveal itself eventually. The harder truth was discovering how much of her own worth had been quietly buried beneath a decade of assuming her contributions were simply understood, rather than protected. Walking away from the life Derek built did not mean walking away from everything she had earned. It meant finally separating her own value from a name she had spent 10 years attaching herself to. Renee rebuilt not out of anger, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that the life she wanted required a foundation she alone controlled. So we leave you with the question so many people have asked since Renee first shared pieces of her story. Would you have stayed on that beach and tried to fight for the marriage, or would you have walked away the moment you saw that message light up the screen? Let us know in the comments exactly what you would have done in Renee's position, and whether you believe Renee gave Derek too many chances that night, or exactly the right amount before deciding to protect herself and her children. And if this story kept you gripped from beginning to end, wait until you hear what happens in our next case. A story involving a hidden inheritance, a secret family nobody knew existed, and a betrayal that unfolds in ways nobody saw coming. Subscribe now so you never miss it, and we will see you in the next story.